Picture this. The year is 900 AD, a battlefield in England. Somewhere in the chaos and noise, a small group of warriors looks different from everyone else. They're not wearing protection like the other soldiers. Their mouths are foaming. Their eyes stare at nothing. They seem to feel nothing when weapons hit them. For centuries, people told stories about these men. They said these warriors were superhuman. They said magic controlled their minds. They said a special mushroom gave them their power. Everyone believed this story. History books printed it. Movies showed it. Video games featured it. But here's the problem. Almost everything people said about these warriors was completely wrong. When scientists finally examined real evidence from ancient graves, when they studied the actual chemistry of drugs, when they looked at DNA from dead bodies, the entire story fell apart. What really happened to these men? What really made them into weapons? And where did they go? The answers are stranger and more interesting than the legends. Let's start with what people thought they knew. These warriors had a name, Berserkers. The word comes from Old Norse, the language Vikings actually spoke. Berserk is made of two parts. The second part means shirt or coat. The first part is tricky. It might mean bear, as in a warrior who wore bearskin. Or it might mean bear, a warrior who fought without any shirt at all. Old stories describe both types. Some wore animal furs. Others fought shirtless in the freezing cold, which seems crazy to us today. But here's what's important. These weren't just regular soldiers. They had a specific job. They did specific things. And everywhere the Vikings went, people described them almost exactly the same way. Let me read you from the oldest stories. The sagas written down in the 1200s and 1300s, but based on stories told hundreds of years before that. One saga talks about warriors who went to battle with no armor. They were strong like bears or wild bulls. They could kill men with a single hit. Fire couldn't hurt them. Metal weapons barely worked on them. Another story, called Eagle's Saga, tells us about a berserker who would change at night. Nobody could even go near him during these times. There's even a poem from around 900 AD written to praise a Viking king. It specifically mentions these warriors. It describes them biting the edges of their shields before fighting. It says they howled like animals as they ran forward. All these different stories, from different places, written by different people, hundreds of years apart, they all describe the same thing. A warrior goes through some kind of change. The warrior becomes wild, the warrior becomes unstoppable. Then later, the warrior collapses and is completely exhausted. This was real enough to matter. These warriors had actual jobs. Kings wanted them around, they got paid, they were famous, but they also terrified people. The same stories that praised their fighting ability also called them dangerous to be near. Between battles, some berserkers would attack farmers, some would go crazy. In several old stories, communities actually hunted down berserkers and killed them after the wars ended, just to get rid of the problem. They were useful as weapons, but scary as neighbors. The wrong answer. For hundreds of years, nobody really knew what caused this behavior. But then, in 1784, someone came up with an idea that would control thinking about berserkers for the next 200 years. A Swedish researcher named Samuel Odman was studying history and nature. He published a paper with a simple answer. Berserkers ate mushrooms. Not just any mushrooms, specifically the fly agaric mushroom. You know, the red one with white spots. The kind you see in fairy tales. Here's Odman's thinking. In Siberia, far to the east, there are groups of people who use this same mushroom in spiritual ceremonies. Shamans take it and go into trance states. They see visions. Odman looked at a map and drew a line from Siberia to Scandinavia. He figured that maybe knowledge about this mushroom traveled west with traders and migrating people. Then he looked at what happens when Siberians use the mushroom and what stories said about berserkers. He thought they matched. So he published his conclusion. Vikings used the red and white mushroom to create berserker rage. That was it. That was his entire case. He never tested a mushroom. He never examined any Viking remains. He never found any mushroom evidence. He just connected the dots in his head and called it science. But here's the thing. The idea was cool. It was simple. It was memorable. A red mushroom. Warrior rage. A magical transformation. Perfect for stories. People loved it. And then something important happened. Nothing better replaced it. For the next 200 years, scientists couldn't actually test whether the mushroom idea was right. The tools didn't exist yet. You couldn't analyze old bones for drug residue. You couldn't test if mushrooms were buried with Vikings. You couldn't compare ancient DNA. So Odman's mushroom theory just stayed. It got repeated in encyclopedias. It appeared in school textbooks. Movies showed it. Video games featured it. Every time someone wrote about berserkers, they mentioned the fly agaric mushroom. The idea had never been proven, but it had become accepted truth through pure repetition. By the late 1900s, almost every popular story about Vikings and berserkers included the magic mushroom. It was the answer everyone knew. The problem was that it was the wrong answer. And when scientists could finally check it, the mushroom story completely fell apart. Testing the wrong theory. Here's what happened when modern toxicology, the study of poisons and drugs, actually examined the fly agaric mushroom seriously. Researchers looked at every medical case they could find. People who accidentally ate the mushroom, people who ate it on purpose, all the documentation going back 200 years. They read everything about what this mushroom actually does to the human body. And the results were shocking. Because the fly agaric does not make you angry and aggressive. It does the opposite. The mushroom contains compounds called muscimol and ibotenic acid. These are powerful poisons that attack the nervous system. Here's what they actually do. They make you sleepy. They make you vomit. You sweat a lot. You can't coordinate your muscles properly. You get confused. Your speech gets slurred. In bigger doses, you just pass out. The fly agaric is a depressant. It slows things down. It doesn't speed them up. A Viking warrior who ate enough of this mushroom to feel different would not be charging at an enemy shield wall. He would be throwing up and falling asleep. But wait, there's more. When researchers actually looked at how Siberian shamans really used this mushroom, they discovered something interesting. The shamans didn't use it for combat. They used it for spiritual experiences. They would take the mushroom, then lie down inside a tent or yurt. They'd stay there for hours, still and calm, while helpers watched over them. They were having visions and spiritual experiences. They weren't preparing for war. The cultural use was completely different from what Odin had imagined. So the mushroom theory had two massive problems. First, the actual chemistry didn't match berserker behavior at all. Second, the cultural practices in Siberia had nothing to do with fighting. By the early 2000s, scientists knew the mushroom answer was completely wrong. And what that meant, they had to find the right answer. What drug actually caused berserker behavior, and what evidence might prove it? The right plant? The real answer came from a different plant entirely. It's called black henbane. The Latin name is Hyoscyamus niger. Henbane is a poisonous plant that grows wild across northern Europe, including all over Scandinavia where the Vikings lived. It was known and used in the medieval period. People from that time period understood it was dangerous, but they used it anyway for specific purposes. The active chemicals in henbane, hyoscyamine and scopolamine, are from a different chemical family called tropane alkaloids. These are completely different from the compounds in fly agaric. Here's what henbane actually does to your body. First, it doesn't make you sleepy. It makes you extremely agitated and energetic. Your heart starts racing. Your skin gets hot and flushed. You feel intense. Second, it creates powerful hallucinations. These aren't pretty, peaceful visions. They're often violent and paranoid. Third, and this is important, it cuts off your sensation of pain. People who accidentally poison themselves with henbane report feeling completely detached from pain. Fourth, it creates a specific symptom that appears over and over in old berserker. Stories, foaming at the mouth. This happens because henbane interferes with your swallowing reflex. You can't swallow properly, so saliva builds up and you foam. Fifth, when it wears off, you're absolutely exhausted for days, completely wiped out. You can barely move or function. When researchers read these effects and compared them to what the old stories said about berserkers, the match was perfect, item by item. The story said, the warrior shakes before combat. Henbane creates agitation and trembling. The stories said, foaming at the mouth. Henbane causes foaming. The stories said, apparent immunity to pain during battle. Henbane produces dissociation from pain. The stories said, collapse and exhaustion for days after fighting. Henbane produces profound exhaustion lasting days. The stories said, elevated aggression and violent behavior. Henbane produces agitation and violent hallucinations. This wasn't close, this wasn't approximate, this was perfect. Point for the more. Point, henbane matched the berserker descriptions from 1,000 years of stories. The mushroom never had. So researchers had the right drug. But was there proof that Vikings actually used it? The evidence in the ground. In 1977, archaeologists in Denmark were excavating an old Viking graveyard at a place called Fyrkat. This was a fortress built around 960 AD during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth. They opened one particular grave, and immediately they could tell it was unusual. This was a woman's grave, dated to around 980 AD. The stuff buried with her was fancy. She was laid in a wagon, which was a huge honor, reserved for the most important people only. She wore silver rings that you see nowhere else in Scandinavian archaeology. Someone had given her a fancy bronze bowl from Central Asia. She had objects that looked like they were used in rituals, things like a metal wand. And then there was something the archaeologists couldn't immediately figure out, a small leather pouch. Inside it were hundreds of seeds. When they sent the seeds to specialists to be identified, the answer came back, black henbane seeds. This womb Anne had collected and stored hundreds of black henbane seeds in a sealed pouch. She had them buried with her. This was huge, because it meant that henbane wasn't some wild plant that people randomly ate. It was deliberately collected. It was processed and stored carefully. It was kept by a specific person, a ritual specialist, someone who had power and status. Old Norse literature mentions a specific type of person called a vulva. These were women, usually, who performed rituals and ceremonies. They traveled between communities. They interpreted visions and spiritual experiences. And most importantly for our story, they administered substances that could change people's minds and perceptions. This Fyrkat woman, buried with hundreds of henbane seeds, was almost certainly a vulva. She was someone who controlled access to this dangerous plant. She was someone with knowledge about how to use it. She was the specialist who would have been responsible for preparing and giving berserkers their drug before battle. But this wasn't the only evidence. Since that discovery, archaeologists have found more henbane seeds in other excavations across Scandinavia. They found them in Viking Age burial sites. They found them with warrior graves. They found them in ritual contexts. It became clear that this wasn't accidental or rare. Henbane was being grown, harvested, stored, and distributed within Viking society. And it was being treated as a serious, controlled substance, handled by specialists, used for specific ritual purposes. The institution. This discovery changed how scientists thought about berserkers. It wasn't some individual warrior deciding to eat a drug to get angry before battle. That doesn't match the evidence. Instead, it was an organized system, a professional operation. Here's how it worked. A young man from a specific family or background would be selected. He would go through initiation and training. He would join a cohort, a group of other warriors like him, serving a king or ruler. When battle came, the vulva would administer the henbane. The dose would be measured and controlled. The warrior would enter an altered state. He would perform at extraordinary levels. He would be deployed with other berserkers in coordinated formations, as shock troops or elite warriors. After the battle ended, the drug wore off. The warrior collapsed into exhaustion. He was cared for and recovered. The system was complete. This also explains something else from the old stories. Why berserkers were dangerous in peacetime. These weren't natural warriors having moments of rage. These were men whose bodies had been chemically altered and trained for specific types of violence. Outside of the controlled context of battle, with the ritual structure and the leadership of their unit, they could be dangerous. They could be unpredictable. It also explains why berserker culture disappeared so fast. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia in the 11th and 12th centuries, it brought new rules and new laws. The old religious practices, and that's what this was, a religious or magical practice, they became illegal. Iceland's law codes literally outlawed the practice of going berserk. Kings stopped supporting the system. The vulvas who controlled the plants were suppressed. The training was discontinued. Within a couple of generations, the whole thing was gone. The institution ended. The ritual disappeared. The drug use stopped. Berserkers stopped appearing in historical records. The missing men. For a long time, historians thought this was the end of the story. The berserkers vanished with Viking society. They became legends. They became myths. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because modern science asked a question that nobody had been able to ask before. Where did these men actually go? Were they a separate population? Were they descended from different ancestors? Were they imported from somewhere else? Were they genetically different from regular Scandinavians? For centuries, scholars had suggested this. Maybe berserkers were a different ethnic group. Maybe they came from somewhere else. Maybe they were descended from older populations. Nobody could test this because the tools didn't exist. But starting in the 2010s, scientists could finally extract and analyze ancient DNA. An international team led by Copenhagen University worked on this huge project. They took DNA from over 400 Viking Age skeletons. These came from all over the Viking world. Norway, Sweden, Britain, Iceland, Greenland, Russia, Ukraine, everywhere the Vikings had gone. When they analyzed this DNA, they discovered something important. Vikings weren't a single uniform population genetically. There was a lot of mixing. People came from southern Europe. People came from Britain. People came from the Asian steppes. Vikings weren't pure or separate. They were mixed and diverse. But here's the key finding. The warrior burials, including the ones that looked like berserker graves, didn't show anything special genetically. They weren't different. They weren't descended from a separate population. They weren't genetic outliers. The burials that archaeologists identified as likely berserker graves, based on the weapons buried with them, the way the bodies were. Positioned, the types of injuries on the bones, these men's DNA was completely normal. They looked genetically identical to the farmers and fishermen buried nearby. Let me be clear about what this means. The berserker capacity wasn't in someone's genes. It wasn't inherited. It wasn't a bloodline thing. It was a system. It was created by a social institution. It was made by specialists who grew a plant, prepared a drug, and administered it. It required training, ritual, and organization. The berserker was a product, not a person. And people were turned into berserkers through a process that had nothing to do with their DNA. The disappearance that never happened. So here's the question the title promised. Scientists finally solved the mystery of Viking berserkers. But where did they go? The answer is almost philosophical. They didn't go anywhere. They just stopped being berserkers. Think about it. These were ordinary Norwegian men. Yes, they had been through a system. Yes, they had been given drugs and trained for combat, but they were still Norwegian. Some of them survived battles. Some of them made it through the Viking Age. When the institution ended, they didn't disappear. They just went home. They settled in the same villages where they came from. They married and had children. Now, here's the genetic part that's really cool. Scientists can trace the DNA from those Viking Age warrior graves down to modern Norwegian populations. Specifically, the same genetic markers found in likely berserker burials are still common in Norway today. The Y chromosome types, which pass from father to son, that appear in these warrior graves, they're still present at high frequencies in modern Norwegian men. Researchers have even traced specific lineages from ancient burials down to living people in the same regions. This means something profound. The berserkers didn't vanish, the men didn't disappear, the genes didn't vanish, the institution disappeared, the ritual disappeared, the practice disappeared, but the men themselves became farmers and fishermen and regular people. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were born. The line was never broken. So what's the real story of the berserkers? It's not the mushroom story. It's not the genetic superpower story. It's actually more interesting. The real story is that the Vikings had a specific institution. They had a technique. They had a drug. They had ritual specialists who understood that drug. They could transform ordinary young men into extraordinary warriors for specific purposes. The warriors would fight intensely, then collapse. They would recover. Then they might do it again, or they might leave the system and become regular people. The system worked for about 300 years, from roughly 800 AD to 1100 AD. Then it ended. Christianity came. Laws changed. The plant stopped being cultivated for this purpose. The specialists who had the knowledge lost their position. The institution was shut down. But the men who had been berserkers, the warriors who had gone through this system, they didn't vanish from history. They got buried in the same ground as everyone else. Their bodies broke down. Their DNA mixed back into the population. Their descendants are still in Norway today, living ordinary lives, working ordinary jobs, genetically indistinguishable from their neighbors. The cultural practice disappeared. The institutional knowledge was lost, but the bloodline was never broken. In genetic terms, the berserker ancestry flows directly into the modern Norwegian population. It was never separate. It was always part of the larger whole. What this means. Let's be really clear about something important. This isn't saying that modern Norwegians carry some kind of berserker gene that makes them more aggressive. That's not what the science shows. The berserker phenomenon was entirely cultural and pharmacological. It was about a plant. It was about preparation. It was about ritual. It was about institution. None of that is written in your DNA. What the science does show is something else. It shows that the berserker wasn't some foreign invader or separate population. He wasn't a genetic outlier. He was a local man selected from the same communities where everyone else came from. The thing that made him a berserker wasn't his bloodline. It was the system that claimed him. And here's maybe the most interesting part. The berserker warrior is the perfect example of how much human behavior is shaped by culture and institution and practice rather than by nature or genetics. Think about what happened. These were ordinary men. Same DNA as their neighbors. Same population, same valleys, same families. But put them through a training system, give them access to a specific drug, place them in a ritual context, and suddenly they become something different. They become warriors capable of extraordinary things. Then stop the institution, stop the training, stop the drug administration, stop the ritual context, and they go back to being ordinary. They farm. They have families. They're indistinguishable from everyone else. The capacity was never in them. The capacity was in the system. The berserker story is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Except it wasn't unsolved, it was missolved for 200 years. Everyone got it wrong because they were guessing. An 18th century scholar made a guess about a mushroom. It sounded good. It got repeated. It became accepted. Nobody questioned it. Then scientists finally had the tools to check. They looked at the actual chemistry of the fly agaric. It didn't work. They looked for actual evidence. They found henbane seeds. They tested the effects of henbane. Perfect match. They looked at the DNA. No genetic difference. Ordinary men transformed by an extraordinary system. The real story is actually better than the legend. The legend is cool but simple. A mushroom makes a man violent. The reality is complex and fascinating. A culture develops a technique, trains specialists, grows and processes plants, performs rituals, and deliberately transforms ordinary people into specific kinds of warriors for specific purposes. That's way more interesting. And the most surprising part? When the institution disappeared, the men didn't. They went home. Their descendants live in those same valleys today. The disappearance never actually happened. That's what scientists finally solved about the Vikings' most legendary warriors.